First of all, thank you for having us. It's really nice to be here. We've both been enjoying the talks today. So Jack and I actually started this conversation back in, are we feeding back? Jack and I started this conversation back in February over email. And so we were thinking it might be fun just to read the initial, just the first two kind of like emails back and forth, the first email back and forth, just to kind of show where it all started. And also I have to say, like, this kind of correspondence, I don't know for you personally, but for me, doesn't happen that often that I have, I have a lot of musician friends and we often support each other in different ways, but to kind of go deeper on a topic and kind of show support for one another is something that was kind of unique and special, at least in my immediate community. Okay, here we go. Hey, I just wanted to reach out in support of what you're doing at the moment. The issues about precarity, inequality, masculinity, and fetishizing wealth and commerce are things I feel really passionate about. And I think it's really bold and inspiring that you are taking steps to address them publicly. I'm sure you're getting a lot of pushback, but it's important work. I'm releasing a record soon that touches on complementary themes, and so thought to get in touch as I'm really hopeful that new options can emerge from concerned artists being in contact with each other. There are a few pieces on the record that talk specifically about new fantasies or new ways to love, which seems really in line with the conclusions you are coming to about breaking the divisive, apathetic climate and trying to imagine something better together. Don't want to bombard you with too much by email now, but it could be cool to talk about it whenever you'd be down. Warm regards.
And I got back to Holly. This is my email. I said, hi, Ollie, thanks for your lovely email. I'm going to shorten what I said because it's basically quite long. But thanks for the support. My theory is that none of what we're saying is particularly sort of new to anyone, even in our sort of own little corner of the music world. So when it comes to music that still is underground in many respects and isn't necessarily massively commercially viable at the moment, it perplexes me somewhat that there's so much sort of silence when we're all kind of clued in on what the sort of situation is at the moment. We're all going through it. Also, I have this bizarre optimism that the discourse is shifting just a tiny bit towards more dissent. I catch glimpses of it every now and then, and I think, okay, let's just push a little bit more, and let's push a bit more and see how far we can take this thing. So, support, and here we are.
So we basically back and forth for several months, and so this afternoon, we kind of went through those emails and picked out some common threads and some themes that we wanted to talk about, hopefully in a casual way. Is there any way that we could dim the lights a little bit?
It's quite intense, yeah.
Because it's creating quite a barrier between
that's much better.
The stage and the audience.
That's a bit better. Cheers.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So one of the topics we were talking about is how the idea of the personal is political, or as Daniel so beautifully puts it, the personal is geopolitical, is a driving force in both our recent records. So do you want to talk to how that's...
Yeah, I mean, personally, for me, speaking as a musician who's released records but has never up until my last album really sort of spoken about, political matters directly or tried to put that into lyrics, talking about things sort of politically can only ever be personal for me, and I was only able to do it through support of people. So, I was kind of going through a bit of a tough time. My partner was really the one that sort of gave me the confidence to write about things, and also the confidence that my own experience, no matter how sort of banal that might be, there might be things in that are worthwhile talking about in relation to, larger sort of political situation in the UK of austerity and just living under a general sort of like oppressive advertising culture that impacts you psychologically and is sort of, bad for your mental health. The personal is political to me, and the political can only ever be sort of achieved with a sense of community. And my personal experience of that is that that had to that is so important to me. That at the heart of any understanding of what's going on in this country, an emotional sort of connection comes first, and that's how I kind of understand things. And actually, I wanted to ask you, Holly, that I read early on, I read a quote from you that really struck me and was sort of quite profound, which talked about, even sort of documenting, if you're an artist, even documenting your, your commute to sort of work in the morning has intense sort of value, and it has a lot of worth in it. Sort of how do you feel about that?
Well, I think kind of similarly, you were talking about how how you came to work on to find this kind of new voice. It's very similar for me. I was working really closely with my partner, Matt Dryhurst. He writes a lot about economic issues around artist precarity. And so him kind of helping me find that voice and then introducing me to Metahaven, we all started this kind of like larger conversation. And I think it was kind of getting over that initial hurdle of just feeling vulnerable or feeling like I maybe had something to say, or like me saying something was actually valuable. We're both kind of from a community where, often when you're a musician who has something to say, that can be widely criticized. Like, I've been told, like, shut up and play music, or like, you talk too much, or, all these kind of wonderful things that, happen on the internet mostly. Like you were saying, having a kind of like a supportive community of people to be able to find a voice, but also like a really sincere and emotional voice, a really emotional approach. I think that was something that maybe I felt the most vulnerable or the most scared of embracing. And I feel like Metahaven and Matt really were able to help kind of bring that out.
Yeah, and I'd agree, it kind of starts with an emotional connection, and then, you kind of go from there. I think another thing is interesting, talking about, how to sort of approach these types of things through our own practices. And for those of you that don't know, Holly and I's music sort of sounds very different to each other, and but we're able to sort of, we have a lot in common, a lot of solidarity with each other about the sort of things that we're interested in. But I sort of wonder, what kind of, what changes might occur sort of like sonically in your work as an artist, but also a producer, when you choose to sort of, make these things, what the work sort of orbits around, like thematically. Like, did you find your sort of sound, is there an intersection of sort of sonics and the things you're talking about on your records?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges is something that I'm still working through, goes back to what I was saying before about kind of finding an emotional voice and being vulnerable. And so one thing that I've been really deliberate about is not trying to adopt an emotional, a pre-existing emotional affect from other artists. So, in music, it's really easy to tap into certain affects to be able to elicit certain emotions. And it was really important to me that I found my own authentic voice in that. And so what that means for me is being able to process my voice in a specific way. Or, people often call it alien or experimental, but to me, it's so much more emotional and so much more expressive to be able to find something that's truly authentically mine instead of like borrowed culturally. So that was one thing that was really important. And another thing, it was really important that, whatever concept I was dealing with, I tried to build that into whatever process went into making the track. So like on a piece like Chorus, which is largely about, our experience of the internet, it was really wonderful to use Matt's Net Concrete software that was actually, pulling sound from the internet. So using that material to talk about that, and so that was to have that kind of, the process and the concept be really tied.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear the same for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, it's, I think my sort of philosophy in terms of making music is basically cheap and cheerful, and I think that's only kind of become entrenched, as I've worked on this sort of last record. And apologies, by the way, if there's if anyone isn't familiar with sort of the actual music I'm talking about, but I've sort of, I try and keep things as simple as possible, and I think a lot of questions of sort of, especially in our kind of world of, kind of independent music sort of production that is, I guess, become you know, quite big sort of over the last few years. You know, there's a sort of question of class politics that needs to be addressed in terms of, you know, I want to say something musically, you know, what financial barriers are in the way of me doing that? You know, I don't have access to a studio. I don't have access to even, you know, expensive plugins. And I feel really sort of proud of that now, that I really want to, you know, it started as a necessity, but I really believe that, you know, make things as cheaply as possible and, you know, push it to the sort of limit. And I suppose sonically as well, on Dream Garden, the album, I was trying to, there was a sort of subconscious sort of slowing down of everything. The tempo's got a lot slower, things became a lot more sort of washed out, and a friend sort of remarked to me that it sounded kind of exhausted. And I quite liked that though, because I sort of felt, well, yeah, that's how at the time I was feeling, and I'm sure that's maybe a state that a lot of people can maybe relate to, is being exhausted, and you know, whether by, you know, an overload of information or, you know, having to work, you know, ridiculous hours. And I suppose as well, that's something I believe in quite a bit as well, is yeah, you know, allowing whatever your kind of state is or what your surroundings are to really seep into the music and take it somewhere that you might not necessarily want to go or think about going anyway. So yeah.
So how do you feel, like riffing on the idea of the cheap and cheerful?
Yeah.
Cheap and cheerful production. So how does it feel with this kind of like flattening or decontextualization that the internet provides, where, you know, your video, your couple £100 video is in like a top 10 list right next to the new Beyonce video that costs God knows what.
But yeah.
And you know how it's all just kind of like pasted together and consumed almost on equal levels.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like, yeah, I mean, it's interesting talking about the videos because, again, my partner and I made the 2 videos for the album together, and we did most of it on our mobile phones and just sort of edited it, you know, very, very quickly. And but we had the sort of freedom to say, you know, whatever we wanted. And in terms of like where that goes, like I think sort of Paul was talking earlier as well about, you know, putting something out there and it being this whirlwind and, you know, something, you know, potentially coming back. You know, you can't control something once you put it out there. And if something I do ends up, you know, aggregated along with, you know, the latest other music videos that were released that week as, you know, in the kind of roundup of this week's content, then, you know, as long as more people see it, I guess, like that's a good thing. But, and hopefully, you know, like, it will look cheap to them and they'll be like, yeah, this video looks, you know, like it's filmed on a mobile, and then it's like, oh, maybe I could do that, you know, like, so, you know, I do sort of really hold the, or try and hold the sort of DIY aesthetics. It's not only something that's important, but is really within, you know, the grasp of a lot of us making sort of music, and, you know, it's there to be fully sort of exploited, yeah.
And I really like that in contrast to the, I guess, like the trend of kind of like hyper commercial aesthetics that we've seen also a lot in our community, where you're definitely like bringing a different aesthetic voice as a different option. And we were kind of talking backstage about how this kind of corporate parody that is so prevalent in electronic music, how it just kind of offers the same option again, but in like a hyper mode. And it often, personally, it makes me feel more trapped within that system, and like there's less of an alternative.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's interesting because earlier on we were sort of talking about, you know, this idea of sort of potential and imagination, and, you know, working sort of as we do, you know, we're not under the necessary sort of constraints in terms of what we can say or what we can't say. And when we have that freedom, you know, like the idea of sort of, you know, like choosing to kind of, I mean, yeah, sort of, you know, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, you know, there's a lot of kind of use of like sort of corporate imagery, you know, luxury, sort of glossy, high-tech imagery. You know, even myself has sort of, you know, made work that's kind of used that in some way in the past as this kind of sort of half-assed attempt to, like, you know, critique capitalism and consumerism by really just throwing up the same aesthetics that you would see in, you know, adverts or billboards or whatever, you know, coming from the underground. And I sort of think, that it's quite dangerous because, as you say, sometimes you want to get away from all that. And I suppose what I would want to ask you as well is that, how far can we push things when we're not under any scrutiny to act a certain way or replicate a certain thing? Like, what kind of questions can we ask? Like, can we sort of, can we afford to be irrational and be like, yeah, the world's really fucked up, but what if it was amazing and all these things didn't exist, or whatever, what if there was an alternative to austerity? All these questions that, sort of how do you do you feel that there's an importance as well that we need to ask irrational questions and dream big effectively, like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk a lot about how I try not to use a lot of nostalgia in my work, because I'm really trying to make work that is planted in today, which a lot of people describe as being futuristic, when I don't see it as futuristic at all. I see it as being very present. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's something that music is really good at, like creating fantasy, creating, personal identity. So if we could just harness that into creating new fantasies instead of necessarily relying on past nostalgia, it could be really empowering, I think. Also, to challenge this idea of irrationality and imagination being kind of like an opposite to being intellectual, or like we've been working with, we had Matt and I in Metahaven, and Jacob Applebaum had the unique opportunity to interview Chelsea Manning, who has often been, characterized as emotional as a way to kind of discredit her work. And so I'd like to just read one question from the interview that that came out a couple days ago in Paper Magazine. So Matt and I asked, it's also pertinent to the talk. London-based economist Guy Standing writes about the left's collective need for paradisic alternatives to our contemporary conditions, something that the right has understood for some time. We see our art practice as an arena to develop and enact new fantasies, without relying on nostalgia or past ideals. What would be your idea of a paradise politics? What are your fantasies for the future? And her answer: it's difficult to say what my kind of political paradise or utopia would look like. I mean, given the fact that humanity has thus far managed to avoid it, yet still improve upon it, a practical and realistic vision of utopia is, I think, currently beyond our biologically imposed ability to construct or comprehend. I do believe that three things would likely contribute to a situation in which we might figure it out: an abundance-based economy where energy and matter are never scarce, virtually instant and infinite access to every other person and all the available information in such a society, and a wisdom or insight that allows such a society to act in harmony. Is it possible? I don't know. I guess we'll find out, won't we? And I actually find her answer to be really optimistic. And so I think in a lot of the work that I've done this past year with Matt and with Metahaven, it's been, a challenge that we've set for ourselves of how can we aesthetically define this new fantasy, or how can we even start to piece that apart? And I feel like I'm just at the beginning of trying to figure that out. It's still very nascent.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about, new fantasies or kind of creating new? I mean, I know that you've spoken vocally in some past interviews about your disillusionment with kind of club culture and kind of like the overt masculinity there, and how our club environments or our club experiences should be these opportunities for a paradisic moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I got into music through sort of DJing when I was about 13, 14, and sort of quite young, and then had friends who were sort of going out and, gradually began to experience that world. I mean, I definitely came up at a time when I'm sure I missed some sort of golden age at some point.
I think we all did.
So, but at the same time, even in, the last year, the amount of clubs that are closed in London, at a ridiculous rate. And I guess perhaps that makes me feel even more protective and invested in the sort of notion of there has to be somewhere where we can go, where any people can go to I guess, yeah, have a kind of irrational sort of ecstatic few hours that isn't, immediately turned into content or, harvested in some way, but it's just, is sort of free from all of that. And I think that a part of wanting to preserve that or wanting to, keep that alive is by also critiquing those aspects of club and club culture. Obviously, the misogyny is a massive problem. Class barrier is a massive problem as well. And I think it's really worthwhile that we talk about these things and have a sort of conversation about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also one of the kind of major things that led to the creation of Platform is not necessarily club dynamic, but almost festival. I don't know if I can say this, festival apathy, or just kind of, being invited to join this international circuit, which is hugely flattering and wonderful, but then kind of seeing as I'm traveling around that it was often kind of the same curation, the same message, the same performances just happening in all of these different places around the world, and it not really responding to what was happening locally, there wasn't really like a dialogue or conversation.
Yeah, and I think there's this, there is sometimes the sort of the disjuncture between, what one's reality might be living in the UK. Obviously, I'm speaking in really broad terms, and what they see reflected back at them in their culture. I mean, one of the things that was really sort of inspiring to me, when I was sort of writing my record was the work of, and particularly the writings of the artist Laura Oldfield Ford, and it was the sort of first time that I'd seen an environment that I was very familiar with be written about in a really energised and critical way. And she sort of talks about Dream Bed Superstore and Costa Coffee and industrial commercial parks and Xbox and Monster Energy, and this is part of a very banal sort of consumer landscape, but that really energised me because when I read it for the first time, I was like, there was no distance anymore. I was experiencing some sort of art that looked like the landscape of in this case the UK in sort of the 2010s, and so closing that gap between kind of reality and, like Paul said, and art is obviously massively important and interesting.
Yeah, and not the banality of your everyday life being kind of like glamorized in this like glitzy corporate version, but instead the actual banality and mundanity.
Yeah, and I think by doing that, you open up the possibility for it to be torn down in even more kind of ecstatic way, sort of like. I mean, sort of, how do you feel about kind of this idea of like? I mean, do you feel that in the music that you make, and do you feel after now your record has been written and released, like how sort of successful do you feel personally in that? I mean, I'm not putting you under the spotlight, but I guess it's interesting though. Like, do you feel sort of like do you feel that? Did it feel good essentially making that record?
It felt great to make it. Yeah. It felt great to collaborate with all of the amazing people that collaborated on the record. It felt really gratifying to be kind of accepted in the way that it was. It was garnered way more attention than I ever expected. But I feel like Platform, or a lot of the ideas behind Platform, it's like such nascent stages still.
Yeah, sure.
I feel like there's so much work that needs to be done to go into, the way that we tour, the way that we structure our performances, the way that we engage with our audience. So all of these things are very much a work in progress that we're constantly trying to question, constantly trying to like rework. We recently started putting our telephone number up on the screen when we play, and people will text in, and then we'll respond to them. Matt does an excellent job of using his British wit to respond in real time to people. So we're just constantly trying to find ways to question, like, audience performer dynamic, or, all of the different components. I feel like, if you really want to be experimental, it should be all parts of your practice should be questioned or should be experimented with. We're in this unique time where we have so many different facets that we can experiment with. So I think we're just constantly trying to challenge and improve. So I would never want to say like, yes, success.
Sure.
I arrived, but yeah. And yourself?
I think our time's up, but I will just say, I think one last thing was that, I think making a record, if you have the privilege and the luxury to do that, you may as well use it as an opportunity of some sort of self-therapy in a way. And I think that's what I do in a part of my work. And I would want to put that out to any young artist or musician. Find a way in which that practice can be, a process that you can work out bigger questions in, and make yourself feel better in a way, and kind of improve your sort of mental health in that way, I suppose. So,
thanks.
That's that. Yeah.